And I don't believe that this is going to solve all the problems between the United States and China. We have very different systems. They're in a process of reform, or they're not. Depends on who you talk to. If they're in a process of reform, we'll make headway. If they're not, we're going to go right back to having problems. But I think there is a role for the international bodies. I absolutely do. And I think WTO reform is an important part of it.
But with that, if it's a process, the sins on the bilateral organizations, is it the timeline, the ability to stall, or is it just the actual adjudication process itself? What can we help in reforming so we're not doing this all the time?
I would say, first of all, trying to look to the future and try to reduce problems is a healthy and important process. But I believe we're going to have problems in any way. So I think we're going to be back here and we're going to be working our way through problems and try to work through those problems always with one eye to the future. But this enforcement process, if we have an agreement, and once again we don't have an agreement, will be very specific. It'll have layers, it'll have time frames, and there will be reaction. And working with Congress on WTO reform is something that I'm eager to engage in. When your schedule permits it. I think there are problems with the WTO that we have to address, and it hasn't risen to the occasion with respect to at least non-market economies.
Mr. Chairman, look, to that point, one of my great interests is, I believe there's technology disruptions, there's always economic disruptions, there's, financing technology that's going to create international disruptions, and we will need some types of dispute mechanisms that move efficiently. How many times have we had constituents come to our office saying, well, we were part of this WTO complaint, but by the time the lawyer fees and everything, we're sitting here, a decade later, we gave up. And it would be a powerful thing as we look at this all over the world. Can we be helpful in fixing that process? And with that, I yield back, Mr.
Thank the gentleman. With that, let me recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Sanchez, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to Ambassador Lighthizer for joining us today. A number of my colleagues have talked about, they have mentioned enforcement mechanisms. And I'm wondering if you are able to share with any specificity how you intend any agreements with China to be enforced.
Well, thank you very much, Congresswoman. I would say I'll do it with limited specificity.
Okay.
So there will be, if we have an agreement, there will be a process that has been agreed to, where at the office director level there'll be monthly meetings, and then I'll go through the process. Then I'll take a step back. At the vice ministerial level, there will be quarterly meetings, and then there'll be semi-annual meetings at the ministerial level. That would be me and the vice premier, who is my counterpart in this. And the idea is two things. One, individual companies will come to us with complaints about practices, and we'll be able to work those through the process. In many cases, those are going to have to be anonymous because companies are afraid to come forward because they know what will happen if they do. They'll have real-world effects that'll be negative. And then in addition to that, there'll be systemic problems where we will see patterns developing and series of things that we disagree with, and we will bring those through the process. Hopefully, in most cases, they'll be resolved at the first or second level. If not, they'll be resolved at my level, and if there's disagreement at my level, then the United States would expect to act proportionately but unilaterally to insist on enforcement. But without that kind of thing, and I should say this is a fairly unique idea, right? I mean, this is not something that has a lot of precedent. But without that sort of thing, to me, then we don't have real commitments.
Thank you. That's helpful because, of course, many people complain that if there's no enforceability, then our trade agreements are not really worth the paper that they're written on. And I know that there are a number of moving parts in the ongoing negotiations, but one sector that I want to call to your attention because it's very important to the economic viability of Southern California is the creative industry. 95% of people who are involved in the creative industry in LA are union workers who have quality negotiated benefits and retirement plans. And the audiovisual sector at large is pretty much hamstrung by how to invest and distribute in China. Specifically, I want to call your attention for current MOU negotiations. I want to call to your attention a commitment that was made by the Chinese in 2012. In the 2012 film agreement, they said that in 2017, they would provide, quote, additional meaningful compensation, end quote, in terms of increasing revenue shares to U.S. studios. And it seems clear that a revenue share of at least 40% of gross box office would be consistent with international norms. Given that resolving this issue would be indicative of China's compliance with the WTO obligations under a trade dispute settlement, can you confirm that that is a priority for the negotiations and a trade deal with China?
Yes, Congressman, absolutely. It's a priority. It's something we've spent a fair amount of time talking about. They know precisely where we are. As you know, it's a complicated issue. The key point, revenue sharing, isn't that complicated, though. They can try to make. Secretary Mnuchin has been very much involved, and he, of course, knows a great deal about that industry, a lot more than I do. The distribution thing becomes more complicated. There should be some changes there, too. But what we haven't done is things that will challenge control, right? It's not something that we want to bring into this, the idea of challenging control in China. But this idea of the revenue sharing, I don't want to get into the details, but I think you probably know them exactly as well as I do. That is something that has not been resolved. It's something we've spent time on. It's something we understand the importance of.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Let me recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Arrington, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was going to refrain from bragging about West Texas, but I had so many of my colleagues talk about their district. So let me just say, Mr. Lighthizer, West Texas is the food, fuel, and fiber capital of the United States of America. And we feed and clothe the American people. We fuel the American economy. That's fossil and renewable. And we provide energy independence and food security. And I'm proud to represent our hardworking farmers and ranchers, and they're concerned. And these are desperate times. And I know you know this, Mr. Ambassador, but, and by the way, good work, great work, hard work. And I know this is a long-term proposition. It's a long-term game changer. And nobody knows about the inequities and the unfairness and the way the Chinese, their bad actions and unfair trade practices better than our farmers out in West Texas, especially our cotton farmers. So keep up the great work. But times are tough, and I just want to remind you that over the last few years, we've seen a decline of over 50% in farm income in the United States, ag industry. That's the steepest decline since the Great Depression. 40% roughly increase in bankruptcies, and I'm sad to report that farmers have the highest suicide rate in the United States of any profession, 5 times the national average. Times are desperate. And our farmers, in spite of that, and our ranchers, they stand with this president 100%. They'll stand with him right up until they have to sell the family farm. But they love him, and they appreciate him, and they know that he's fighting for them. Let me talk about cotton, because when you fly into Lubbock International Airport, you're going to land in the largest cotton patch in the world. We produce about a third of the world's of the cotton that we export out of the United States. But we've lost 50% of our market share in China, and it is an awfully big market. We want reforms, Mr. Ambassador. We want the equitable, reciprocal, and enforceable structural reforms that you talk about. We're Americans first. We want that for every American job creator, manufacturer, producer. But you've mentioned this, the purchase commitment, and we've heard a lot about soybeans, a little bit about pork. Talk about cotton, because we have 17-state cotton belt, $21 billion industry. We produce the most and the best cotton in the world, but that Chinese market, as a result of that 50% loss, our guys are suffering. Can you talk about cotton being mentioned in your purchase commitment discussions with the Chinese, please?
So, first of all, thank you for that, particularly for the comments about the support for the president. as you know well, you can't talk to the president about trade without having the farmers come up, right? It's like the first thing he talks about is usually the last thing he talks about, too. So and Secretary Perdue, as you know, I don't know all the secretaries of agriculture, but I can't imagine there's ever a better one. He's just full on everything for agriculture, and we happen to be in the middle of a long-term trend that has been very bad. So all of that is appreciated, and the president keeps us very focused on it, as does the secretary. In terms of the purchase commitment, absolutely cotton is a factor. It's something that China needs, has traditionally bought, and it's easy to buy more of. So it is something we understand that these people have suffered, and it's something that's in the list of things that we expect them to have substantial increases on, and it's something that the president keeps us very focused on. And I have specifically gone through with the president the various items. So I'm talking to the president of the United States about these numbers for these ag. And by the way, it's these big commodities. It's hazelnuts. There's a lot of things that I've had members talk to me about, and I keep track of it, and I go through it dutifully.
You're doing a great job. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Now, based upon the ratio present in the room, we will now move to 2 Democrats and then recognize 1 Republican. Ms. Delbeni is recognized to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for being here with us today. I was pleased last month. We saw 76 countries agree to start negotiations to develop global rules on e-commerce. However, I'm concerned that the recent inclusion of China in these talks could weaken those overall efforts and lead to a watered-down agreement, since their current digital regime is so radically different than ours. In your bilateral talks with the Chinese, are you pushing them to address critical issues like data localization, forced disclosure of source code, restrictions on cloud service providers, and banning customs duties on electronic transmissions? This would not only help many American companies operate in China, but would also help make China a more constructive partner in important multilateral negotiations like the e-commerce initiative. And if we don't address these issues immediately, we risk creating new digital borders, and those digital borders could create massive disruptions in the digital supply chains that we have. So I'd love your thoughts on how you're addressing these issues.
Well, thank you very much, Congresswoman. You know this is something that I care about, so I'm putting this in the softball category. Number one, I completely agree with you. Strategically, what we should be doing is having a small group that writes real rules on e-commerce and then expand the group to other people. The more people you bring into the negotiation, the harder it is to get any rules that you and I would think of and many other members would think of as actually world-class kind of rules. The kind of rules we need, by the way, I would just point out, are in USMCA, right? That's like the gold standard for all of this stuff. It's the absolute gold standard for all of this stuff. And it's probably a bridge too far with respect to some of these people. But I think bringing China in will not help these negotiations. That's number one. Number two, are we dealing with these issues with China? Absolutely. We spend an enormous amount of time on data localization, on data transfer, on source codes requirements in a whole variety of areas. And I mean down to absolutely the most minute detail. And I'm happy to sit down with you at some point and kind of go through it just so you can get some actual appreciation. But I mean, it's me sitting down with among the most senior officials there, talking about precisely where there are circumstances in which it's appropriate to require source codes. And there are some, emergency rooms. There are some strange things, but we have had we haven't concluded, we're not done yet, but we have made headway. It's whatever it is, it's not going to be what you and I think of as a model agreement, but we will make substantial progress, I believe. And these are really, really important issues and I agree completely with you. This is one of those things. We should lock in rules that stop barriers in the beginning of an industry. Once you get protectionism set in all over the world, it's much harder to change practices than it is to have people adopt best practices at the beginning. And so it's very important. It's also a big issue for just colloquially for us. We're good at it, and we ought to have that.
So as you know, U.S. technology companies and specifically cloud service providers, face significant market restrictions and forced technology transfer requirements in China. The 301 tariffs also impact them because another key inputs to data centers are subject to these tariffs. And so particularly when we talk about that, I'd like to know what your commitments are to pursuing forced technology transfers, but also are you looking at things like eliminating foreign equity caps and licensing requirements so that U.S. companies don't have to rely on Chinese companies to operate?
Yes.
Thank you. I know we're out of time. We can follow up more too. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentlelady. With that, let me recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Chu, to inquire.
Yes, Ambassador Lighthizer, I represent Los Angeles, the heart of the film, television, and music industry, and also I'm co-chair of the Congressional Creative Rights Caucus. And I wanted to follow up on what you said earlier about the unfair practices affecting the film industry. Part of the unfair practices has to do with the revenue share, of course. The average for the nation in terms of revenue sharing with regard to films in China is 40%, but for the U.S., the revenue sharing is 25%. And so that, I believe, is so important to address. But on top of all of this, the U.S. film industry brought a market access case against China to the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization ruled in favor of the film industry, and an MOU was entered into by both parties. And in that MOU, the Chinese committed to engaging in consultations in 2017 and provide additional meaningful compensation in terms of that revenue share. So my question is, have they engaged in those consultations, which were supposed to be done in 2017? And if not, what is your plan for enforceability in this regard?
So we have had discussions, and we have had discussions that predated the current 301 process. But now, because we haven't made sufficient progress, we're folding them into this 301 process, and it is one of the services issues. The revenue share, as you said, is crucial, but also trying to make some improvement on the distribution side of things, because the reality is that competition there helps also. You know, I don't know if I can predict success. I would say they are very difficult negotiations, you know, as of the last time they were here. But your industry is very well represented by you and other members and by MPAA, and so you know, we're focused very much on it, and I think making it part of these negotiations increases the likelihood of a successful outcome. But it's a difficult issue. You find just philosophically in all these kinds of areas that you sort of dig in and you say, why is there this or that protectionism? And it's almost always a situation where there's an interest in the other country that has an actual, you know, is getting richer as a result of it. It's very seldom philosophy, although there are cases where it is. But in this case, there are people there who make money on basically squeezing us, number one. Number two, they want to develop their own industry. Yeah. So there are, as you know, I don't have to go through it. You know the reasons why we have this problem, but it's something that we are focused on. Hopefully we'll come to a conclusion. We're not asking for the moon at all. What we're asking for is what is normal.
Well, I thank you for continuing to press on that issue in these trade negotiations. Also, I wanted to make a statement about a company in my district, iRobot, which employs 675 American workers, engineers, scientists, and which developed the famous Roomba, the robotic vacuum. So it employs so many people in my district, but the Roomba is manufactured in China, and the iRobot is on that third list of tariffs. Right now, iRobot is paying 10% in retaliatory duties, but it may go up to 25% if the deal is not reached. And so they are very, very anxious about having some way to apply for exclusions for that third list, and I just hope that you can make that process happen.
Well, I have certainly taken the position that if we go to 25%, we will. I've made that commitment, have an exclusion process. Short of that, I want to sort of see where we are And I hope that they're thinking about ways to manufacture more in the U.S.
Thank the gentlelady. With that, let me recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Holding, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ambassador, always a pleasure. I'm very glad to see that the administration is willing to tackle China's unfair trade practices rather than just talking about it and complaining about it. I think we have bipartisan support in the room to agree that China is a strategic trading partner that plays by the rules when it behooves them, but otherwise ignores them. And Mr. Ambassador, as you know, I'm from North Carolina, which not only has the best barbecue in the country, but we're also one of the leading pork-producing states in the country. I'm glad I didn't hear any objection to that.
We won't subtract that from the gentleman's time.
In 2017, the U.S. shipped over $1 billion in pork to China, but with punitive tariffs, over 50% of our pork exports to China have slowed down to a trickle. The lost sales to China have caused hog producers in my state to lose $8 per hog, and collectively an annualized loss of $1 billion. And I know you've made progress with agricultural purchases, especially for soy and poultry, and I appreciate your good work there on behalf of my farmers. But obviously, there's a tremendous demand for pork in China, and with the Chinese pork production in steep decline because of African swine fever, it seems like it is time for significant U.S. pork shipments to China, which would, of course, put a big dent in the trade imbalance. So can you give us any indications as to where you are on pork market access in the negotiations?
So thank you, Congressman. Yes, but you're absolutely right. Pork is one of the issues that's very important to us. Before we talk about the purchasing, it's also important on the SPS area, where we have specific problems with lack of scientific basis for some of their restrictions. So that's another area in which it comes in. If pork is something we've talked about, we would expect, if we have a deal, that there would be substantial pork improvements, particularly, as you know well, given the fact that China has issues with their own pork production right now that are substantial. And this is something we have talked about. It has been quite specifically addressed, and we have gone back and forth with numbers. So, and I'm happy to talk to you about it offline, but we are making headway, and if there's a deal, and if there's a package, I'm confident that there will be substantial good news for our pork producers.
Thank you. Switching to 301 tariffs, we're working with you to find ways to work on the exclusion process. One option in particular I'd like to work with you on is the criteria that expeditiously excludes products that are regulated by other U.S. government agencies, where those regulations already constrain the ability of importers to access those products. For example, products regulated by the FDA, where the FDA's regulatory framework means that consumers cannot quickly shift to other suppliers. The existing regulations by our government already constrain supply for the consumer, and I believe we have an opportunity with the List 3 exclusion process to address these products and minimize consumer impact. So that's the area which I hope that we can work on together in the future. That doesn't really require an answer, and I'm out of time. That works well. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. With that, let me recognize the gentlelady from Wisconsin to inquire. Ms. Moore.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and I do want to thank the ambassador for his patience and indulgence. A lot of stuff has been covered already, so I won't regale you with the repetition. I do want to say that while these tariffs have had draconian impacts on all of our constituents and districts, they're having an impact on China as well. But many economists seem to think that China is adapting and that they're recovering. One of the things they're doing is by expanding their export markets. So a question that hasn't been asked is, we don't have a functioning export-import bank now. Do you think that that's having an adverse impact on our trade position?
Oh, thank you for that question. Yes, the answer is yes, it's having an impact, and it's way beyond China, and it's costing us jobs, and there's no excuse for it, in my opinion.
Okay,
So
thank you.
I don't know what else to say.
All right, I know what to say, but I won't carry you there. You have talked a lot about science-based decision-making. I was also, one of the things that our companies have leaned into, and it was a provision of Dodd-Frank, where companies would report and refrain from using conflict minerals in their products. I was wondering, is that a consideration for, in terms of unfair trade practices for China to use conflict minerals, thus undercutting the prices of their products?
I'm of course sympathetic to your objective. It's not something that we've talked about, and if there is a specific unfair trade action that we should be thinking about, I'd be happy to work with you about it, but it's not something we've spent time talking about.
Okay, I would love to work with you on that, because that could severely undercut our products, our iPhones with these minerals in it. We want to make sure that they're not being produced or taken from countries where people are being murdered and unfair labor practices.
I'm very sympathetic to your...
I do want to follow up with my colleague on the Republican side, talked about lists of things that are really critical. And I know that my colleague from Wisconsin probably waxed on about how this is hurting our folks in Wisconsin. More specifically, I have an initiative to try to prevent sudden infant death syndrome. And one of the products that we have found to be very effective and cost-effective, especially for poor women, is something that's marketed in the United States as a pack and play. It's a cribette that's only made in China, and it's been subject to these 10% tariffs, and if we were to continue these tariffs, it would be out of the reach of many consumers. And so I was wondering how to get these pack and plays on that list of don't touch items, because we can't get these pack and plays from anywhere else.
Well, thank you, first of all, and I can't help but say how important USMCA is for Wisconsin. Now, having said that, my guess is we ought to be manufacturing pack and plays in the United States. Why is it that they can't be manufactured here?
Well, can you manufacture them before my great-granddaughter is born March 23rd?
Well, maybe we'll just let you use my granddaughter's version. She can just say she doesn't need it anymore. She's outgrown it. So, no, I don't want to be flip about it. I'm sympathetic. The bottom line is we ought to be manufacturing these things in the United States. That's what our objective is. We ought to be paying people here to manufacture these things. And I would also say a 10% tariff on that product, assuming it doesn't go up, a 10% tariff on that product versus what it would have cost 6 months ago with the devaluation of the Chinese currency. It's probably a 2 or 3% increase in price. My guess is it's not going to price too many people out. And if the cost of that 2 or 3% on the price of that is a bunch of people have jobs that they wouldn't otherwise have, that's, personally, that's a trade I'd make.
Thank the gentlelady. Let me recognize the gentleman from Michigan to inquire. Mr. Kildee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and thank you, Ambassador Lighthizer, for being here. And beyond that, thank you for your willingness to engage with us on a regular basis. It makes a difference, and I very much appreciate that. You've been quite accessible. And I have a question, but before I get into that, I'd also want to note how much I appreciate you bringing up the polysilicon issue with the Chinese during these negotiations. It's important that we address China's retaliatory tariffs in response to legitimate American trade remedies. That's important to me. It's important to my district, and I appreciate your efforts in that regard. Obviously, the Congress and the administration need to work together to deal with China and to hold China accountable for unfair practices that are costing American jobs. And there, I think, is general agreement on that score, bipartisan agreement. Many of us wish that it was more of a multilateral approach, but one area that I know was addressed, but I wasn't here to hear your answer, has to do with currency manipulation. President Trump promised to label China a currency manipulator on his first day in office during his campaign. Obviously, that didn't happen. And I know you agree with the president's general sentiment that China engages in bad behavior and manipulates currency. In fact, in 2010, you testified to this committee that China should be labeled a currency manipulator and was in violation of its WTO obligations. You have thoughtfully outlined a list of actions that the U.S. needs to take to address China's currency manipulation, but I would like to get your perspective on whether or not the understanding that the President recently announced with China on currency issues meets the requirements that you had laid out in your previous testimony. Simply put, does this deal meet the standards that you laid out in 2010?
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I would say, first of all, whether or not China is manipulating its currency right now, competitive, it is an issue that we can talk about. It probably is, but it's probably not manipulating it to lower its currency. It's probably manipulating it to raise its currency because they're in a different position than they were in 2010. So that's one thing I would say. It is not a foregone conclusion that China is manipulating its currency down right now. And I would say that this is a decision that the Secretary of Treasury makes in conjunction with the President, not me. But I do not think you can make a case that right now China is intervening in the market to have their currency be weaker. Right? That's not in their interest, and they're probably doing the exact opposite of it. Have they done it in the past, in my judgment? Absolutely true. And were they doing it when I made that testimony? That's absolutely true.
And I don't think you can rule out the possibility that some moment in the future we could see that happen again. And that's why the structural approach to these issues is more important than looking at this moment in time, or even in the context of a deal that we might see negotiated is founded on sort of temporary transactional benefits as opposed to structural benefits.
I completely agree with your statement, absolutely 100%. And what we want to get is commitments to not have competitive devaluations in the future and to a certain level of transparency. If you have those two things and they're enforceable, then you can guard against that problem in the future. And the other point I made before you weren't here is that this is an issue beyond China. We think of it as China. There's a lot of places in Asia where this is a problem and a lot of places where it has been a problem in the past. And there's a lot of people in the United States that aren't working right now because of this issue. A lot of people who were told, well, you just didn't do a good job, and they were doing a fine job. They just got cheated on currency.
My time's expired. I appreciate your attention to these issues. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. With that, let me recognize the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Smith, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for making time to be here today. Today, we're here to talk about China. China has been taking advantage of U.S. workers for a long time, and I think that the President, along with yourself, Ambassador, deserves a lot of credit for sticking your neck out on this very difficult issue. It's clear that progress is being made and that there's real potential for positive structural changes after years of deception and false promises from China. A lot has been reported on the recent negotiations, and I appreciate the light you're able to shed on this process. The news we heard last week about new Chinese purchases of U.S. soybeans is especially encouraging from someone who represents a very large agriculture district in southeast Missouri. I'm hopeful that we can achieve more than just the status quo with China, but go well beyond current market access. I would like to reiterate the comments that was made from the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Arrington, in regards to cotton. The only thing I would disagree with that is Missouri cotton is a little bit better than Texas cotton, but we definitely are like-minded when it's about opening up the markets. I do want to bring up rice, which is extremely important to the Boot Hill. Rice farmers have been fighting for over a decade for access to Chinese markets. While the administration has made progress in gaining access, since 2017, China has been displacing U.S. rice in our territories. By undercutting the price, So while U.S. rice struggles for access, China's access to our domestic market below traded prices continues to grow. Are you and the administration investigating the situation, and what are you doing to address it?
So, thank you, Congressman. Yes, absolutely. First of all, to your first point, structural issues are fundamental to what we're talking about, and I've tried to make that point. I read in the media all the time. I read today in the New York Times that we weren't making any headway on structural, and it didn't even cite anybody. It made some other comments, by the way, and it cited contacts of Lighthizer. I thought, what's a contact? Is that like somebody I bump into at the grocery store? Contacts. That's a source, is a contact. But that's another issue. I won't get into it. In any event, any further than I already have, the fact is that we are making headway on structural issues, contrary to what may be read here and there, and the President believes they are central to having what anyone would consider to be a great agreement. And that's what his instructions to me. His instructions to me are, you have to get a great agreement, or we have no agreement. We'll just wait until we can get a great agreement. So now on the specific issue of rice, yes, rice, number one, is a subject of purchasing that we have to have. Number two, we have, as you know well, we have 2 WTO cases, one of which we have won and been announced, the other which has been decided but it hasn't become public, so I won't tell you where we are on that. But those are 2 cases, and resolving those cases in the context of this agreement is something else that we're talking about. So whether we succeed in that, we'll see. But on the issue of unfair Chinese access in the United States, if there are issues where someone has a case that they want to bring and have my office talk about, I'm happy to talk about it. I, as you know very well, because we've talked a lot, I'm completely into enforcement. I think if we don't enforce these laws, the whole basic consensus in favor of the trading system breaks down, and I think it has broken down. So I'm happy to act on that, very quickly.
Thank you, Ambassador. I have several other questions I'll just submit for the record, hopefully to get the response, but appreciate your response.
Thank the gentleman. With that, let me recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Beyer.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Ambassador, thank you so much for being with us all this time. Ambassador, we've been discussing, and of course you're particularly compelling on the point about how China simply refuses to operate under what we consider to be a lawful and rules-based trading system. And of course, this extends beyond just trading rules. On Monday, Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein spoke at CSIS about what he called China's transactional approach to the law, citing China's willingness to detain foreign nationals on specious charges to gain negotiating leverage or force an outcome from a foreign government. This isn't how our justice system works, or it's not supposed to work that way. After the Huawei CFO's arrest, the president said, quote, "If I think it's good for what will certainly be the largest trade deal ever made, which is a very important thing, what's good for national security, I would certainly intervene if I thought it was necessary," end quote. And during your meeting in the Oval Office with the Chinese Vice Premier, the President again discussed the possibility of, quote, talking to the U.S. attorneys, quote, and talking to the Attorney General. He hinted further that this would be a subject for trade talks. I know you're not responsible for law enforcement. I know you're not responsible for the Huawei prosecution, but you're certainly responsible for the trade deal. Are you familiar at all with any further discussions within the administration regarding using this case as leverage for trade negotiations? We've seen firsthand that you're willing to be forthright with the President. Are you not concerned that adopting a transactional approach to the criminal justice system, close to what the Chinese would do, will undermine our own legal system and incentivize reciprocal actions, as we've already seen with the Chinese targeting of Canadian citizens?
I'm not aware of anything on this subject. I don't get involved with it, and I'm not aware of it at all involved in what I'm doing.
All right. Thank you. Most of our national trade discourse, particularly the popular discourse, centers around heavy manufacturing and agriculture, despite the fact that 75% of Americans employed in the private sector work in services of one form or other. In my district, we have tens of thousands support their families with good jobs across a wide range of services. I know you really focus on the trade deficit in goods and left out services altogether. I always want to make sure that we know we run a surplus in services. But nevertheless, both the National Trade Estimate and the Chinese WTO compliance report note that American service companies face significant trade barriers across a number of sectors. And given our general competitive advantage in these areas, it's safe to assume the service surplus could be a lot larger. China places significant restrictions on legal services, ICT, cloud services, a whole range. Can you provide us with some detail on how the concerns raised about services are addressed in your current talks, and can we expect concrete changes in Chinese competitive behavior in this sector too?
Yeah, thank you very much, and I'm remiss in not making that point clearly. Services is a crucial part of what we talked about, and we spent a lot of time on it. I brought one of my many negotiation books, which I'll be happy to show you at some time, because somebody looked at it and saw the notes and they said, God, that really is a terrible job you have, Lighthizer. But here it is. Banking services we spent a lot of time on, cloud computing services, credit rating services, electronic payment, express delivery. I won't go through all of them here because someone will say, my God, insurance services. I mean, we spent a lot of time in great detail, right down to the sub section on pages and pages and pages of services. And you're exactly right. Services jobs are equally good jobs. The United States has a surplus in services, which is very important, and millions and millions of people work on them. And we should be doing much better, because in many areas we are by far the most competitive in the world. So this had an enormous amount of time spent on it, and it's sort of less thematic and more specific, right, if you can follow what I mean in these negotiations. But there was progress made on a number of these fronts.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Evans, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, Mr. Ambassador, would like to thank you for coming before this committee today. There are 100 Chinese firms operating in Pennsylvania, supporting over 3,000 jobs. Pennsylvania imports over $17 billion from China, and Pennsylvania exports $2.5 billion to China. Mandarin is the third most spoken language in Philadelphia. But the question that keeps coming up, and this came from our Department of Economic Development, is the issue around intellectual property when it comes to investment. The concern, and this question has probably been asked over and over again to you, so forgive me for repeating it again. The issue about intellectual property of our domestic companies to protect long-term, can you speak specifically to that again?
Oh, absolutely, Congressman. First of all, I will repeat one that I said before, and that is that I have found that Chinese Americans are just almost to a person ones who will say, hang tough, we need structural change. This is the only way we're going to get structural change. Don't cave, don't sell out for soybeans, or all the kinds of things that you and I have talked about and we both agree on. So, and I think that Chinese Americans will be people who will, number one, they have a stake in the change in that system, and number two, they'll be beneficiaries from a business point of view. On the IP front, China has very little IP protection right now. What we did in this negotiation, and I'm going to talk to you later, and I'm going to stick all this in front of you, we went through section by section by section of what we would consider to be sort of best practices intellectual property protection are, and we negotiated those provisions. We didn't get everything we want, but you need things like a proper definition of what intellectual property is, a proper definition of what trade secrets are. You have to make sure you have criminal enforcement at some point in the process. You have to make sure you have deterrent level penalties, because if you don't have that, you have a problem. You have to make sure you have neutral people making decisions. It's all the kinds of things that you would say, yeah, that's more or less what we would expect in a system. Now, there's variation, and as I say, we didn't get all of it. But the people with whom we dealt in China want to reform this process. I think they legitimately want to reform it. I think they legitimately view themselves as creators of intellectual property instead of just consumers of it. And when that changes, people have a different attitude. So Chinese creators of intellectual property now want protection and have more power than they would have in the past. So we have an enormous amount of detail. I'll just spend 10 seconds and show you my book when we're together, and you can sort of see. But this was a detailed discussion. It's extremely important. And I would say the final thing, when they put this in place to the extent it's agreed to, because they think it's in their interest too, then there'll be the enforcement issue, right? We'll be going down. It's going to be as a change for China to do this, but it's something they seem to want to do.
Real quick, Mr. Ambassador, you raised the issue about banking. Development projects and companies relying on Chinese investment to infuse capital into their projects and work. The restrictions on capital inflow is a concern for future investment.
Well, look, the president wants Chinese investment just like he wants everybody else's investment. That creates jobs and it helps Americans. What we don't want is investment in areas where they're going to end up taking crucial technology from the United States. So there's a balance there, and some people will come in, and what they really want is technology and not investment. In other cases, they want investment. The president's position and the Secretary of Treasury's position is quite clear. We want investment from China, just like we do from everyone else. But we don't want investment where it's going to go into crucial technologies and end up losing technologies, which is going to hurt us in the kind of things that Mr. Bauer talked about and cares a lot about. So there's a balance there, and it's very important that we meet that balance properly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank the gentleman. With that, we will recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. LaHood, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ambassador Lighthizer, welcome back, and thank you for your toughness on China. And we're lucky to have you as our negotiator going up against China. I have the 8th largest ag district in the country in terms of corn and soybean production, heavy manufacturing base, and there is a lot of anxiety in both of those industries, as we've heard today. The Wall Street Journal just came out with an article in the last couple of months. The ag economy is down 13% over last year, directly related to tariffs, directly related to the trade war with China, and so a lot of stress and concern there. However, most of my constituents in my district support the president in going after China. And you mentioned at the beginning of your statement, quote, technology is going to rule the future. And how we change the behavior with China seems to be the crux of what you're getting at with your negotiations. And historically, looking over the last 25 years, no president from Clinton to Bush to Obama has been able to do anything on this front, whether it's cyber threats, forced technology transfer, stealing intellectual property. We have not been able to change that behavior to put China on the same playing field as every other industrialized country in the world. And that really seems to be what we're trying to get at. And having said that, you've talked a little bit about our leverage in this negotiating process. And as I look at what you're trying to do here, I'm wondering whether this is going to be different in terms of what's going to be different this time in changing the behavior in China. And I'm going to submit for the record, this is an article from Reuters within the last 2 months here, and the title is, China says U.S. accusations of unfair trade practices are groundless. And in there, the spokesman from China goes on to say that, says the U.S. side made groundless accusations, and China finds that totally unacceptable, and that's from their spokesperson, and I'll submit that for the record, Mr. Chairman. And I guess as we look at what you said earlier, how do we have structural change? How do we get to a more laws-based system? And I know that's what you're getting at. So 2 questions, Mr. Ambassador. First of all, on the ag side, as we begin planting season for our farmers, what assurances can you give my corn and soybean farmers and pork producers that the market share in China will be there when we resolve this eventually? And then secondly, as we look at this different approach that you're taking, what gives you confidence that this approach is going to be different, and what if it's not? What are the consequences to China if we're not able to hold them accountable moving forward and changing that bad behavior? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Congressman, for that question. It covered a lot of territory, and I have 1 minute now to respond, but I will do it as quickly as I can. First of all, in terms of the soy and corn, we are trying to, number one, get more sales, more purchases, not in the question of corn, it's also in the question of ethanol,
yep,
which of course is a huge user of corn products, of corn. So I believe if we have a deal, there'll be a substantial, in the case of soy, we've already seen a substantial amount of additional purchases recently, and we've seen a certain moving together of soy prices back to traditional levels in terms of the foreign competition. So we've seen some impact, particularly with the most recent 10 million metric ton purchases that the Chinese have gone into the market for. So if we have a deal, I think we will, we will see substantial new sales there, and hopefully some other improvements in terms of SPS stuff. How is this different? It has to be enforceable. It's got to be specific, and we're covering many more areas than anyone's ever covered. But it requires the grit and determination of the president, and it really requires the cooperation of people who want to reform in China, and there are people in that. And the alternative is what's been going on, and that for sure failed. So we know that approach doesn't fail, and hopefully ours will succeed.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank the gentleman. With that, let me recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Schneider, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ambassador, thank you again, not just for your time here today, but the availability you have given us throughout this whole process. Being from Illinois, I share the concerns of my colleague for our farmers in our state. I represent the suburbs of Chicago, and just want to share a quick story of a constituent, firsthand experience with some of China's bad practices. They were working on some product designs, trying to get some samples. Company in China was delaying, and ultimately the company in my district started seeing their products showing up on shelves here in the United States. A clear theft of intellectual property, and this is something that's happening throughout the country. It's happening for businesses large and small. So I agree with you that China is a bad actor and that we can't let their devious behavior go unchecked. We need to level the playing field for American businesses. In a level field, our businesses can absolutely succeed. But I have real concerns with the way the administration has approached the problem, creating and escalating a trade war that's caused harm to many businesses throughout my district. Last summer, I visited a number of companies to talk about the impact tariffs were having on them, and everyone was very concerned that it was hurting their ability to compete. But it's not just businesses. A local school district in my district had to spend $2 million in contingency funding to cover the increased costs and materials for a remodeling project. So I was pleased to hear that you've made progress in the discussions and the March deadline was delayed. In your testimony, you mentioned that this administration is pressing for significant structural changes to allow for that more level playing field. What specific structural reforms or other policies are you pursuing in these negotiations to help our businesses that are experiencing hardships in the Chinese market? And can you assure me that these reforms will be not just meaningful, but long-lasting, and that they're looking towards the long term? And can you please share with the committee what outcomes you've secured thus far to help businesses like my constituent and those throughout the country that have been harmed by these Chinese companies?
Thank you, Congressman. I would say, first of all, your example of intellectual property theft, and you heard from your constituents, I've gotten many, many more. We could sit down and exchange stories at some point. And that's a pattern that has to change, right? If that is real people losing money, losing market share, not only overseas and in China, but actually in the United States, right? I mean, they literally are competing against people that have sold the stuff in the United States. And so we are making headway. People say, well, tariffs are a blunt instrument, and my response always is, but we don't have any other instrument, right? If the Congress wants to sit down and talk to me and worry about creating new tools, I'm happy to do that. I'd love to do it. We're using the tools we have. We know that just sitting around blathering hasn't worked for 25 or 30 years, so we have to try something new, and I think we've gotten to a point where we might have success. We'll find out. Hopefully we'll have success. How will it be long-lasting? We'll see. The reality is this is going to be a challenge. It goes on for a long, long time. My guess is it goes on long after I've left, and hopefully by the time you're sitting in the chair, you'll be sitting there making sure that the people who are in my job are continuing to do that, because enforcement tends to be about people. And if we're not going to enforce this agreement, they'll figure it out pretty quickly, and that'll be the end of it. What all we can do is try to set up a situation where we have the potential that if people go in here and have the right attitude, the tools will be there that they can be successful, and that's what our objective is. And we're using the tools that Congress has given us as imaginatively, I've told one of your colleagues, as imaginatively as possible. When I testified in 2010, I thought we have to have imagination. I think that's what the president has shown here, imagination and then grit, right?
If I can use my last couple of seconds to emphasize something else that you said as well, so thank you for that. You mentioned that technology is our biggest asset, and we have to protect that intellectual property, that technology. But it's more than that. It's the application of that technology in this country. It's the continued innovation to think about the next technology, and it's the alliances we build around the world to apply those. So I appreciate that. With my time up, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. With that, let me recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Sawazi, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, thank you so much for your public service. We really do appreciate the hard work that you do on behalf of the country. For decades, since President Nixon and Secretary Kissinger, and certainly since the end of the Cold War, the U.S. has operated under the assumption that with increased economic integration and exposure to our system of capitalism and democracy, that China would ultimately adopt some of our systems, at least in part. That simply hasn't happened. Not only has Communist China eschewed democracy and engaged in awful human rights abuses, repression, and abuse of religious minorities, such as the Uyghurs and the Tibetan Buddhists, not only have they polluted the air, the land, and the water and treated their workers poorly, but they've not transitioned to capitalism or a market economy. The Chinese state communist government not only cheats by stealing intellectual property, restricting access to their markets, but the Chinese government subsidizes its industry. The 2019 Fortune Global 500 includes 111 Chinese companies, of which 78 of those companies are viewed to be 50% or more owned by the state. Could you share with us your sense of what the long-term policy of the United States is and the goals that you have as part of this negotiation to have long-term structural change on this relationship?
Joshua, thank you for that question. That's a great opportunity, and all of your colleagues are saying, I hope Lighthizer is unusually short-winded. I would say this, you raised the fundamental question. There was a myth that grew up, and if you look at my 2010 testimony, which I think is really quite good testimony, it's been referred to on several occasions here today and in the past, the myth was that if you open up a market, if you have an economy, you will become democratic, small d democratic. That is the myth. You'll open up that will lead to an open economy and to an open political system, and all of a sudden we're all a bunch of people from Ohio, where I'm from, right? That's the myth. And the reality, and that was literally professed by all the smart people, all the clever people, and that really is what led us to PNTR. And it's precisely what I read. You weren't here. I read the speaker's quote, which was very prescient, saying this ain't so. And she said it, and she was right. And all those smart people were wrong. The reality is that it doesn't. You can have a very good economy and not have any freedom, or have very little freedom, right? You can. We made assumptions. Well, I didn't, but assumptions were made that were incorrect. So I completely agree. And the tone of your remarks were, without saying every specific part of it, are why we have a bipartisan view on this and why we're making success. It's because of people like you that we have success. If this was a partisan thing, it wouldn't be. The fact that it's bipartisan is why we're making success on this.
So what's the goals of this negotiation specifically to try and have long-term structural impact? And will we ever get to a place where we think that China represents something closer to what our system of capitalism is? I'm not going to put democracy on your shoulders too.
So I would say on the second one, we'll find out. You're younger than I am. You're more likely to have a better view, right? Because you'll get there and see it. I don't know what our objectives are. Objectives are to foster reform in China, which there's a group of people that want to do, to lead to structural reforms on the kinds of things where we can within the confines of the statute that you've given us and the report that we did. Here's our report, and here's our, if you haven't seen it, and here's our supplement, and it's.
Well, we can't get to the whole report in the last 3 seconds I have left, so I'm going to take you up on your offer to try and work with you to see if there are other tools that Congress can help to give you and people like you to be more effective in the future. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. With that, let me recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Kelly, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for being here. You know, part of what we do, we get a chance to go around our district and talk to people when we're back home doing our district work weeks. And last summer, I stopped in a place in Newcastle, Pennsylvania called Blair Steel. Blair Steel got started in the late 1800s when Pittsburgh was known as the Iron City, before steel became the product of choice and how it took off. So I asked Mr. Kenney, I said, Mr. Kenney, looking at what's going on right now, what could we have done differently? And he looked at me and said, I'll tell you what we could have done differently. We should have elected this guy 39 years ago. Now people say, oh, no, that's exactly what happened because we have taken a back seat and somehow we think that if we're just nice, other people will play by the rules. I think Mr. Swazi is right on top of this. And a lot of my colleagues have said the same thing. We have to be damn fools if we don't think we haven't been in a trade war for decades and we're afraid of a trade war today that's already taken place and has taken heavy casualties. We just never stood up to it and said, hey, you're taking advantage of us. But we're so damn nice, we're not going to call you out on it. Other than what you're doing right now, and I mean this sincerely, because you said maybe Congress could help out. This administration and your tireless efforts to make sure that everybody's playing for the role. I am so damn tired of forfeiting the game and then crying because we lost. This is absolutely stupid. We have allowed ourselves to get into this position. What could we do differently? And I want to tell you, I think most of it is stand 100% behind this administration and don't let these people get away with what they've been getting away from for so many years. An old saying, and this is very crude, but there's an old saying out there, if you're in a peeing contest with a skunk, the only way to beat him is to out-pee him. I got to tell you right now, I think we are in a trade war that has taken a heavy toll across the United States, and we sit back and we just don't want to offend anybody. I am so offended by us not being offensive that it is sickening what we've allowed to happen to manufacturing and intellectual properties, and you name it. We've been gamed so badly for so long. Anything else we can do to help you, Mr. Ambassador? Mr. Ambassador?
Well, let me say, first of all, it really is important, and I've said this is my theme, well, it's been my theme for 2 years, that these things have to be bipartisan. They cannot be partisan. This is just different than a lot of other stuff we deal with. And hearing the last two questions shows why exactly it is bipartisan, right? Why this is a fundamental, both intellectual and gut reaction to what is going on. And I think supporting us, supporting the president when we get this package together, if there is a package, and I'm not there yet, as I say all the time, that we have to look at it and get behind it and say this is a great step forward, but you have to stay, you have to keep your eye on making sure that we enforce it, and that I enforce it, and that my successors enforce it, and that years down the road that new presidents enforce it. So, and then the second thing I would suggest, which I've said before, I'd love to work with members on new tools. I think we need new tools. Yeah. I won't go through it here but what's happened to 301 is troubling. Right? So, and I don't want to go through all of
just because we talk about 232 and 301, I got to tell you, when I go back home in Western Pennsylvania, people don't look at me and say, tell me exactly what's in 232, or tell me what's happening with 301. That goes back to 1974, and the reason we did it is because of unfair, unreasonable, discriminatory trade practices, right? So these are things that Congress created for the President of the United States, the executive branch, to handle for us. I believe it's going to take eternal vigilance. I think that what you said earlier, our trade agreements are like children. They last as long as they last. We're in grave danger, I think, in this country of thinking that somehow people will play fair with us because we're nice as opposed to being vigilant. Thank you so much for your time and your effort. I know you don't sleep very often because we've talked before. You're doing one hell of a job. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. With that, let me recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Panetta, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Brady, and of course, Ambassador Lighthizer. Thank you very much for being here. I think in the 116th, just on the Ways and Means Committee alone, you've been here 3 times within the last 2 months, and I think that says a lot about you and your commitment to working with us, and we look forward to continuing to work with you, not just on this, but of course the USMCA as well. As well as trade with China, is very important to me and my district there in California. As you know well, California is the #1 ag-producing state in the nation, although I appreciate the questions from my other members here on the dais. California is what it's about when it comes to agriculture, and the Central Coast of California being the salad bowl of the world is what it's about when it comes to being agriculture, and it contributes to that title that we are the #1 ag-producing state. But obviously, these tariffs, these retaliatory tariffs have affected our farmers. You have over 800 food and agricultural products that are being taxed, and unfortunately, a lot of those products can be obtained from other non-U.S. trading partners. And so what we are seeing is the closing of certain markets. Now, I appreciate the fact that there is an aid package of $12 billion, and I actually spoke with some of my almond growers yesterday who were benefiting from that. But I can tell you, and what we've heard and what you've heard, I'm sure, it's not about aid, it's about trade. And it's not about short-term bailouts, it's about long-term business. And so my question to you is, in regards to these markets that are potentially being shut off, that are being closed, what are we doing to recoup those markets in regards to your negotiations with China?
Well, thank you, Congressman. First of all, the problem on retaliatory tariffs and market opening goes beyond China. I should say that. And one of the things we're doing is we're having negotiations in a variety of areas. We're at a bit of a stalemate with Europe right now because they won't include agriculture. We have our talks with Japan, which have a very big agriculture component. We have USMCA and the 232, and I'm looking forward to working with you on passing USMCA because it's so important for California and Illinois and everyone else. So I'm working for now in terms of China, which unfortunately is only part of where we've had retaliatory tariffs. If we get an agreement, those tariffs will come off, and then the president's hope is, although it's not the purpose of the negotiation, that the purchases will have the effect of not only giving short-term sales, and by the way, we're looking at numbers that go out several years. It's not like I should make this point, even within the purchases, which contrary to what's in the newspaper, is not the function, the purpose of this. Those purchases are going to have targets and amounts that go out for several years. But our hope is that if you increase those agricultural sales and you do it for a period of years, you will create new customers that will have results that go on years and years and years and years into the future. So this is it's a very real thing that the president's worried about. Obviously, when you get into a situation where you're trying to bring change about, it's going to have costs. No one has been more treated less fairly than the farmers, right? I mean, they are in a position where they should have enormous markets. I mean, in China. China's a big market for us. As I say, they're our second or third, depending on the year, market, excluding, of course, 2018. But there's a much bigger market there. I mean, there's a lot of people there, and with any kind of fair trade, farmers would be beneficiaries too.
Thank you for bringing that understanding into these negotiations. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We will now revert to 1 for 1 on both sides, and with that, the chair would recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Reed.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ambassador, it's always great to be with you. And I really do echo what my colleagues have said about you. I think you're the right person at the right time to take on this much-needed negotiation with China. One of the things I want to bring to your attention and maybe your thoughts on, as well as my colleagues, to focus on a little bit as we deal with these tariffs and the future after we negotiate this agreement. I do believe we're going to be able to negotiate an agreement, and you have one chance, very limited runway, to do this right, to make a fundamental shift in our trade relationship with China. But, one of the things I see, and I see the Chinese position, they're thinking long-term. They're always thinking long-term. They're not looking transactional. And so as I see the negotiations proceed and the tariffs that are on the books and reaction in China, I see their commitment as a co-chair of the U.S. Manufacturing Caucus to build up excess capacity. And I'll add another issue to it, excess inventory of certain products, so that when that new marketplace is created, what are we going to do to protect American markets from that excess capacity and inventory that would then be dumped or thrown into the U.S. market in a very dangerous way, in my opinion. Do you understand what I'm getting to? Because as I see manufacturers, as I see folks, especially in advanced manufacturing, I see China reacting to this transaction of what we're dealing with these negotiations. But as these tariffs come off, as we operate under this new agreement, how are we going to minimize the adverse potential impact of what the Chinese 2025 long-term vision of positioning them as a world leader in manufacturing to protect our manufacturing bases here in domestic soil?
I mean, thank you for that question, Congressman. That's a fundamental question. I want to make one point clearly, and that is, I think the United States has been guilty of short-term thinking and short-term view for sure, but I don't think that's true of President Trump. President Trump, that's why he's going after structural changes. He is looking down the road. He's thinking, he wants to know what's going on way down the road and have the United States still have this advantage. We have to be number one. We just have to stay number one. And by the way, most people in the world want us to be number one, right? I mean,
I totally agree with you. So what are you going to do when that valve is potentially opened up? Are there going to be strict enforcement mechanisms?
So you have to have strict
sure
enforcement. Let's remember, no matter what happens, we have to maintain strong laws against unfair trade. We have to remain strong anti-dumping laws, strong countervailing-duty laws.
So if that inventory is dumped on the U.S. market, what are we going to do to make sure that that enforcement is there and easily executable by us to take on that Chinese action?
So, number one, we have in here provisions, if it's agreed to, that will limit subsidies specifically in cases of so-called competitive industries. That is to say, where there is this problem of excess capacity. What you're talking about is what's happened in steel, what's happened in aluminum, what's happened in solar panels, what's happened in washing
Advanced
machines.
manufacturing.
On. There's an agreement to limit subsidies in those kinds of cases. There are unfair trade laws, and then there's the enforcement provisions in here. This is a pattern. And by the way, it's not always even a plan. Sometimes it's just they start this, and the provincial governments and the local governments all kind of get into it, and they don't have a way even to put their own brakes on, right?
Well, so do we at least agree that that potential threat is there, I'm raising?
I absolutely think it's there. It's undeniable that it's there.
And we want to put enforcement mechanisms readily available to us as partners in this agreement that we can then deploy against China. We may need to make it very clear, I think, to China that we're ready to use those. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
That I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Murphy, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ambassador, presumably the goal of Section 301 tariffs is to cause China enough economic pain to persuade China's leadership to negotiate an enforceable agreement curtailing its abusive trade practices. And in a previous answer, you noted yourself that tariffs are a blunt instrument. You know, not only are they not precision guided, they can have unintended consequences, often for U.S. consumers and small businesses. And I imagine that before you made the unilateral decision to impose tariffs on China, you weighed the cost and benefits and designed those tariffs to maximize the damage to China and minimize the self-inflicted damage to companies and consumers in the U.S. and to the broader American economy. Whatever your intentions were, I have to tell you the evidence on the ground is really grim. I've had small business owners in my community in Central Florida break down when they talk to me about the impact the tariffs are having on the companies that they have spent a lifetime building and on the workers that they view more like family than they do employees. For example, David, he's the owner of a 30-person electronics firm in Orlando that imports components from China and sells finished products to American retailers. His business has been upended by this third tranche of 10% tariffs that took effect on September 24th. When he went to work that day, he had to pay an upfront bill of $280,000 to release his goods from China that had already landed at a U.S. port. No notice from his government, no time to adjust, and since September, David has paid over $800,000 in tariffs. It's a lot of money for a small business. So what he's had to do is raise the cost of his products. Some of the big retailers have agreed to pay more, but they're just passing those costs on to consumers. And some smaller retailers just simply won't accept the price increase, and so that means that David has lost business. These tariffs have decimated his cash flow, jeopardized his financing, and made him unprofitable, placing his workers' jobs, my constituents' jobs, at risk. And unlike his bigger competitors, David doesn't always have ways to mitigate the harm. So if this 10% tariff endures, the damage could be really severe. And if it increases to 25%, the damage could be fatal. In 40 years as a business owner, he tells me he's never seen government actions interfere so directly with his businesses. And I know you're not insensitive to this issue, but what do I tell these small business owners like David, whose livelihoods are on the line? when is this going to end? What will their sacrifices have allowed you to achieve? And do you think you're going to be willing to accept a deal that falls short of what you've indicated you wanted to achieve in order to end this trade war?
So, first of all, we are sympathetic to situations like David's, although I don't purport to know the details of it. But there clearly are people who import products who are negatively affected. I would suggest that this is a 10% tariff, and that with the depreciation of the Chinese currency, it's probably having a 4 or 5%, maybe less, maybe 2 or 3% effect on his business. So I just would make that statement. In terms of notice, of course, you know that we go through a notice and comment process. This process of putting these tariffs in place was months going through with hearings and all the. So I don't want to let anybody have the impression that this is something that just we woke up and did this. No, there are laws and we followed them, and there were months and months and months and months and months of process going through here. I always start with the proposition of, do you think we have a problem with China? If you don't think we have one, then all of this is crazy. If you think we have a problem with China, then we have to weigh what is necessary to move forward. And in terms of what we're willing to accept, no, I don't think we should accept anything that doesn't have structural changes and is enforceable. Absolutely not.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. With that, let me recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Rice, to inquire.
Ambassador Lighthizer, thank you so much for being here. I have told you repeatedly that one of the things that gives me the greatest confidence in this administration is people like you and Secretary Ross that have taken on these jobs to lift up American workers. Heartened by your observation about the loss of the 5 million jobs since China entered the WTO, and your objective in taking this job and doing something about that and lifting up our middle class. Because you see, I believe that our middle class, that American workers can compete with anybody in the world on a level playing field, and that we here in Washington have allowed that playing field to be tilted against them for far too long. Beginning around 1990, we were competitive at that time in the world, but we sat on our hands and allowed everybody else to change their economic systems, including their tax system, regulatory structure, trade policies, and so forth, to take advantage of American workers. And 30 years ago, we could accept trade agreements that weren't necessarily in our favor. We were so far ahead of the rest of the world, but we can't do that anymore. So I'm really proud of what the President's done, restructuring our tax code, restructuring our regulatory system, and I think the next most important thing we can do is to balance our trade agreements. Your progress on NAFTA is so important and so impressive. Your progress with China gives us great hope, although I heard you say at least a dozen times today that it's not done yet. But I just want to applaud you on how far we've come, because I don't think there's anything more important at this point, after tax reform, after regulatory reform, that we can use to make our economy competitive and allow our workers to compete on a level playing field. Once we get through this, we need to move on to infrastructure. I want to tell you that I had a town hall in Loris, South Carolina last week, and a group of farmers came to my little town hall in Loris, and they're worried. They grow peanuts and tobacco and cotton and soybeans primarily. And they said to me, you know, we're worried about this disruption with China. It's certainly affecting our business. What can we expect? When can we expect? You know, how quickly is it going to be resolved? And we talked about all that. And I promised them that I would raise these issues to you here in this hearing. So they're watching you right now. Hello, everybody back home. But that being said, when we got through, they also asked me to tell you that they're behind you and they're rooting for this president, and they recognize that this has to be done, and they recognize how important it is. So in my last minute, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I am going to ask you to tell my farmers back home as best you can what they can expect.
Well, you know, thank you very much, Congressman, and thank you for your comments about me. I'm grateful for that. I would just make the obvious statement, and that is that, like other members in my position, people in my position, we are inspired by and empowered entirely by the President. If it wasn't for the President, I'd have no power and no inspiration. So I'm happy to have this opportunity to be able to at least fight for the things that we all care about. And so we'll see how that turns out. I would say to these farmers, I think that they have been victims as much as anybody in America of what goes on in China. And I think they have they are more vulnerable than a lot of other people for a whole variety of reasons that we all know about. And that if we have an agreement, there's a likelihood that we'll begin the process of the payoff. Once again, if we don't enforce and we don't keep on it, it's not going to happen. Fortunately, we're not in a world where just good things happen automatically, right? So if we do our job and if we get an agreement, I think there's going to be a good payoff for them. And the president is very grateful for their support. He understands exactly that these are real people putting it on the line for him. So thank you.
We thank the gentleman. And with that, let me recognize the gentleman from Nevada to inquire, Mr. Horsford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and to the ranking member for this opportunity and the hearing. I appreciate, Mr. Ambassador, that though these negotiations have been ongoing and fraught, that our congressional committee is finally getting an opportunity to address concerns that we've heard from our constituents about and that directly impact each of our districts. So I wanted to first say, Mr. Ambassador, we want you to be successful. On behalf of the American worker, the American business owner, the American consumer, all of whom are depending upon the successful outcome of your negotiations. I wanted to share with you that in Nevada, it's estimated that $107 million worth of exports are threatened by new tariffs. Nevada's exports to China total $28.7 million, and these exports affect an estimated 367,000 jobs in Nevada. As the price of steel rises, so does the construction cost across our state. There is currently an estimated $25 billion of planned, proposed, and currently under construction major projects in Southern Nevada. Projects like the Raiders Stadium, the Las Vegas Convention Center expansion, and public projects including expansion at our universities, all have become more expensive. Food is also a big component of exports threatened by the U.S.-China trade deal. Everything from food, bread, pastries, condiments, and even milk. So companies that make everything from metal castings to appliances to the dairy sector and even bakeries are impacted. And since last March, the administration embarked on a series of tariff actions that drew retaliation from trading partners. And I know that, Mr. Ambassador, you have talked about the need to focus on enforcement and structural changes as part of this process. But what hope and relief can we give to our constituents about some of these pressing impacts that we see right now based on this ongoing trade war with China?
Well, thank you, Congressman. I would say, first of all, in these circumstances, one has to begin the analysis, as I said a minute ago, why is there a problem, right? And if you believe there is a problem where we are right now between the United States and China, and that problem threatens our future and our kids' future and all of those people who we are very concerned about and who are adversely affected, if you don't believe those people are potentially very seriously affected unless we change policies there, then there's no point in this. But if you do think those people's futures are threatened, then you have to go through this process. And our objective has been to try to minimize the effect. As the Congress lady said, we have to minimize our effect on our own consumers and maximize the effect on others, and we try to go through that process. But when we get out the other end, we have to be in a position where we have actually defended our workers and our farmers and our ranchers, and we have the potential for structural change in China. And I think we've done a reasonably good job of minimizing that effect on our own consumers. That is to say that individuals aren't particularly affected substantially, and we have an exclusion process to try to help that out. So we're sympathetic and focused on it. In terms of the steel, I would just say generally, I want to get a steel agreement. The president wants me to get some kind of a steel agreement if I can with Canada and Mexico. I think that'll alleviate some of that problem. And
thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. And with that, let me recognize the gentlelady from Alabama, Ms. Sewell, to inquire.
Last but not least, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for being here today. This discussion is long overdue. In fact, since the last time you publicly appeared before the Ways and Means Committee, this administration has imposed a 25% tariff on $50 billion of imports from China and another 10% tariff on $200 billion of Chinese imports. The Chinese predictably retaliated with a tariff of $100 billion on U.S. exports. We are all aware of China's unfair trade practices, and you're right, the fundamental question is not just do we believe there's a problem with China and trading? We do. I think universally all of us will agree with that. I think the more fundamental question is what do we do about it? I think that it's important that we do something about it, but I can also tell you that the tariffs have had a really devastating effect on the folks back home in Alabama. In fact, I have three concerns about the 301 tariffs as enforcement mechanisms. First, it is a go-it-alone strategy that I am concerned about that this administration is taking when I really think that we could have put to use our alliances and created multilateral pressure on China and probably been a little bit more effective quicker. Secondly, while we in Alabama do believe that trade works for us, we really believe that retaliatory tariffs don't. And the retaliation that has the most impact on my district has been both with farmers as well as with my manufacturers. According to a Brookings study, Birmingham, Alabama has the 5th highest exposure to retaliatory tariffs in the country. Since the trade war with China has begun, Alabama exports have faced over $254 million in retaliatory tariffs. And moreover, my cotton and soybean growers' supply chains have been dramatically affected. The longer the tariffs are in place, the more likely it is that a lot of the shifts in the supply chain will become more permanent, causing more concerns by lots of my constituents. In fact, the forest industry in my district is suffering from a 25% tariff on southern pine logs and a 10% tariff on the softwood lumber. So I guess my question really is one of a fundamental belief that while there is definitely a problem, a trade problem with China, is the enforceability of tariffs, the way we're doing them, the best way to get at that problem? So my question is, especially given the fact that we're looking for Section 301 tariffs as a tool to enforce other trade agreements, my question to you really is, do you see the Section 301 tariffs as an enforcement tool of last resort when all of our options have been exhausted, or do you see it as a weapon that can be deployed regularly to exert concessions from other economic rivals and allies?
Well, I would say, first of all, I don't want to conflate tariffs with other tariffs, right? Because, I mean, as you know well, there's the softwood lumber, that's a litigation matter brought by private people. The steel and aluminum is something entirely different, in my opinion. I think 301 is an effective tool. I think we should be working with members to find more effective tools. And I can, at some point, I want to sit down and take you through the history of 301 sometime when you're just like ready to go to sleep and you can't get to sleep. I'll take you through it and go, because it's kind of an interesting.
Since I sit on the Intel committee too, many sleepless nights for me.
I guess that's right. So there's a history there. I think we need better tools. But in terms of whether or not we should have done what we did or did a multilateral approach, I honestly believe that good people tried for 20 years the multilateral approach and the talk approach and the let's all go along, get along approach. And I can tell you, at some point I'll show you, I brought along, I have a chart here that sort of shows the trade deficit with every one of these go along and get along. There it is right there. So here's the trade deficit, and here's every one of these go along joint things. They just demonstrably failed. And when you're in a situation where something really, really matters in our kids' lives, jobs depend on it, and you've tried something and it's failed for 20 years, you'd have to be crazy, in my judgment, not to try something else. Now, is this perfect? I'm not going to say it's perfect, but it at least is leading to results where everything else didn't.
Now, I just want to say thank you for allowing the ambassador to complete his answer. And I just really want to just say in closing, we're all really, really, your success is our success. We do want to get a better balance when it comes to trade with China. And I want to thank you for being open enough to come and talk to us on a regular basis with respect to these tariffs and the trade agreements.
We thank the gentlelady, and we will conclude with the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Ferguson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, thank you so much for being here today. It's been fascinating sitting here and listening to both sides recognize a few common threads here. Number one, China has been participating in unfair practices for years, and it has hurt American business, it has hurt American innovation, and most importantly, it's hurt the American worker. Consistently, I hear throughout my district the support for these efforts to really put China into a new trading position with the U.S. Across the board, whether it's Republican or Democrat, small business, large business, they all understand the need to do this, and they also understand the need that, because we have not done it in the past, that there is going to be a rough transition period while this fight takes place, but it will be worth it in the end. So I want to commend you and the administration for fighting so hard on behalf of the American worker. You know, as I look at this, another thing that is we recognize this, and I've heard a couple of comments along these lines talking about the context of the China deal and with everything else that's going on in trade. Could you speak, because we all recognize the problem with China, and we all recognize that it's a very large problem to deal with. Can you speak to the importance of getting the USMCA deal done on the heels of the South Korean deal, and then bringing Japan into the fold, and then moving to the Europeans? Can you speak to how important it is that we all develop these trade deals so that we can collectively work to change the Chinese behavior?
Well, thank you very much, Congressman. Thank you for your comments about the President's program, which I think is working, and I'm certainly going to pass along to him the various comments people have made about what we're trying to do. But you are right, and I said this at one point, and I'll say it again. There is no trade program in the United States if we don't pass USMCA. There just isn't one. What it says is that we don't have a consensus and that we don't want to stand up for our workers and our farmers and our ranchers. I think there's no less than that at stake. We have an agreement. It's clearly better than its predecessor. There's no question. It's $1.3 trillion worth of business. Millions and millions of people are affected, and it just has to pass. If it doesn't, you have no credibility at all with China, and you will have no credibility on any deals with your other trading partners. I have members come to me as I tell you, every day I talk to 2 or 3 members, just literally every day. And it's always constructive and this, and they have ideas and they have thoughts and all this, and I always in the back of my head think, if we don't pass USMCA, just don't bother. Just sit down and just say, we'll just wait a few years before we say anything.
I want to thank you for that and addressing that, but I want to switch gears for just a minute. In my hometown, we have an automaker there, Kia Motors Manufacturer in Georgia. We have seen the benefits of having a good trade agreement with South Korea. We want to continue to see that. One concern that I have, and if you could address it very quickly, the timelines both on the USMCA and potentially any trade deal, 3 to 5 years for implementation. Talk about how that to me seems like a relatively tight timeline. Is there opportunity, if companies are moving in the right direction, to give some leeway as they try to bring jobs back to America?
Could you hit? USMCA requires a very short transition. They can get the additional 2 years if they are meeting certain requirements. We've worked with the manufacturers. Is it a tight time frame? Yes. Is it a doable time frame? Yes. We have to make changes as soon as we can. by extending this out, I mean, we have consensus among manufacturers, and by extending it out, you're just postponing new Americans getting their new jobs, and I don't want to do that. We want these people to be employed as soon as possible. So this is a doable thing, and by the way, we want them to be manufacturing more engines and more transmissions in Georgia, and I think they're going to, and they're going to quit using the Korean engines and transmissions to a large extent. So this is going to be a big win for you, but I don't want to defend them. I already pushed it off as far as I'm going to push it off. Who knows where I'm going to be in 5 years?
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Ambassador, let me thank you for joining us today. As always, your accessibility is appreciated by the committee. Please be advised that members have 2 weeks to submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. And with that, the committee stands adjourned. Thanks, Kev.
Good job.
Thank you.
Good finish.
Were you hanging around in the hallway?
He dove through the door there.